Chapter 3, Section 1, the Constitution. So, our Constitution, which was written in 1787 and ratified in 1788 and put into effect in 1789, is comprised of three sections. Those three sections are the preamble, the articles, and the amendments. The preamble to the Constitution is the opening paragraph, and this 52-word paragraph sets the stage for what the new government will look like. So you can consider it like your thesis. And this is the preamble. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the start of our Constitution of the United States. And in a moment, we will go over each of these six goals of the Constitution. But before we do that, let's look at the rest of the Constitution. Much like the Articles of Confederation, the Constitution is made up of seven simple articles. And we'll get into these articles later on this week. But they are the first article created the legislative branch. That's our Congress. The second article created the executive branch. That's our president. The third article created the judicial branch. And that, of course, is our Supreme Court. The fourth article discussed relationship between the states because, as you remember, under the Articles of Confederation, each state acted independently and therefore didn't get along. So now we're saying this is why you'll play nice. The fifth article, how to change the Constitution. This is adding amendments. The sixth article is the Supremacy Clause, and that states that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. A constitution is a written form of government. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And finally, the seventh article, it talks about ratifying the Constitution and making it into law. So the last part of the Constitution are the amendments. There's 27 amendments. In 231 years, there's only been 27 changes. And the first 10 came right away. And those were known as the Bill of Rights. The last time we had a change to our Constitution was in 1992. And that amendment, folks, was the second amendment that was originally posted of the 12 amendments. And it was congressional pay raises. But it wasn't ratified until 1992. It just sat in the books that long. Now let's take a look at the six goals that are listed in the preamble. The first goal is to form a more perfect union. And in this case, we're looking at strengthening the relationship among the states as part of a union and between the states and the national government as part of the new federal system. You have to remember that the federal system is an American invention. So we're talking about how do we relate to this new government, which the central government is stronger now as opposed to where the states had all the power. And that, of course, is making it more perfect. So we get rid of the articles, we bring in the Constitution, we recognize there was a problem, and now we're trying to solve that problem. And many of the men who were, or the framers who were at the Constitutional Convention, they had a history of political philosophy with history in Greek and Roman Empire. So they knew exactly what they wanted to do and how to do it. In essence, they knew their decisions would have long lasting consequences, and they were determined not to repeat the mistakes of the past. Our second goal is to establish justice, and this is where we're going to provide laws that are reasonable, fair, and impartial, and make sure that the administration of those laws is also reasonable, fair, and also impartial. And impartial means without biasness. So when we take a look at the justice system and the Supreme Court, and we look at the rules that they come up with, actually the Supreme Court doesn't come up with any rules; they make rulings. Then the states have to abide by those rulings by making new rules to fit to those rulings. By doing so, that's meant to maintain order and peace in the United States, and we have seen in the last couple of months that that hasn't necessarily happened. Our third goal is to ensure domestic tranquility, and this is where we're keeping peace and maintaining order within the country. Again, we looked at Shays' rebellion last week. We don't want another Shays' rebellion. We want to avoid those types of issues. Of course, this past year, with all the different mobs that have occurred and the violence throughout the United States, people are questioning this goal of the Constitution at this point. Our fourth goal is to provide for the common defense, and this is where the nation will be defending itself against all foreign enemies. And so you understand, we have the Navy, the Army, the Air Force, the Marines, the Coast Guard, as well as the National Guard to defend us in this country. And you'll see those six again. The fifth goal is to promote the general welfare, and this is where we allow all the states and citizens to benefit, whether it's through military or economics, from the protection of a strong national government. And when we're talking about the general welfare, you also have to look at the coronavirus, COVID-19, and what is our government doing to protect us? And that includes everything from shutting schools down to limiting our capacity at restaurants. If it's for the general welfare, then the government has the right based on this goal. Now, I'm sure we could sit here and debate whether or not our government's actions has benefited us throughout the coronavirus. Again, when you limit people and you change their habits and behaviors, you're going to have people that are angry and upset. So, again, if this was a class discussion, we could obviously sit there and say what is working and what isn't working. And eventually, I think when everything is said and done, everyone in here will have known someone who has had coronavirus. Our last goal is to secure the blessings of liberty. And folks, what we're talking about is to protect the liberties that were recently won by the American Revolution and preserve them for the future generations to come. And that's what it's about. What are we doing to protect our future? Yes, we're obviously living here and now, but at the same time, if you go back to our worksheet where we had everyone in the cave, your goal is to work for the future. And in this case, that's what we're doing now. Everything we're doing now is for the future. Now that we've looked at the preamble, let's take a look at the Constitution itself. And in its structure and its language, the Constitution expressed six basic principles of governing. And that's what we're going to go over now. So the first principle is popular sovereignty. And the word sovereignty comes from the Latin word to mean rule. And popular is by the people. So you have rule by the people. And when we're talking about popular sovereignty, the power lies within the people. And how we ensure this is through elections. And of course, the 2020 election, we saw millions of people come out and vote. It was amazing. And when we talk about that, you have the majority and you have the minority. And so the Democrats and Joe Biden, as the winners, need to respect the fact that the Republicans, who are in the minority, have a voice. And because the election was so close, the Democrats should listen to some of the Republicans. And of course, the Republicans need to respect the fact that the Democrats had won and that they need to work hand in hand. Now, does that always happen? No, we know that that doesn't always happen. But that's what popular sovereignty is, and that's how it should work. Our second principle is limited government. How much government is too much government? At what point do we stop the government from interfering in our lives? Should the government say how much we're allowed to eat? After all, America is a very obese nation by population and weight. Should they be restricting McDonald's from giving us a 64-ounce soda with our value meals? Should our government require us to pay heavy taxes if you're a smoker? Um, and again, these are just things. How much government is too much government? And obviously, we could spend a week talking about that in class if we had the time. So the third principle is separation of powers, and this is where we um, establish the three branches of government. You have the legislative, which is Congress; you have the executive, which is the president; and you have the judicial, which is made up of the Supreme Court. And when we're talking about these, there's something called checks and balances, and so each branch. And well, actually, let's get into checks and balances now. So, with checks and balances, each branch of government has the authority to check or restrain some power on the other two branches. And its goal is to prevent one branch from becoming too powerful. Um, and again, each branch is able to limit the power of the others. But again, when you look at this and you look at the Supreme Court of the United States, um, remember, once these people were nominated, and affirmed onto the Supreme Court, they're there for life. There's no challenging, there's no changing unless they do something very unscrupulous that'll get them impeached. It's highly unlikely that would happen. So they're spending between 20 and 30 years on that bench. Now there are checks between the president and the Congress all the time, whether it's you're talking the power to veto. Veto is a very popular thing by the president. Um, when the president vetoes something, he nullifies it, and Congress can override those vetoes if they so choose. Um, but that's just one way that we look at um, the checks and balances for the Senate or the Congress. Their checks on the Supreme Court is going through just like we saw with Amy Coney Barrett. Um, they had all these discussions with her, and they put her through the ringer. So that's one example of checks and balances from the Senate to the Supreme Court. So here's a little system of checks and balances slide for you. Congress being at the top, President being in the lower left, and Supreme Court being on the right. Congress can impeach the president. They can override a veto. They can reject appointments. They can refuse to approve any treaties, whereas the president can veto legislation. They can appoint all federal judges. Um, and Congress can impeach a judge. They can reject appointments of judges. Whereas the Supreme Court then can declare acts of legislation unconstitutional, which is what we see all the time, and or they can declare presidential actions unconstitutional. And again, these are all things that we'll get into with later chapters, but I just wanted to make sure you had a quick snapshot of this. Our fifth principle is judicial review. And this is basically when the Supreme Court gets to hear a case. Now, they can hear a case if someone has an appeal, or if they themselves, as the Supreme Court, look back and say, we're going to decide on a court case that we see in one of the lower state courts. And so this, is, of course, is called judicial review. And the Supreme Court has the power to strike down laws or make them unconstitutional based on the Constitution itself. And they do that through precedent, so past cases. And lastly is federalism. And this is where we share power between the state and national government. Um, so again, whatever the national government doesn't have, then the states have that right. And there's been a lot of confusion over this, and there's been a lot of states trying to override a lot of federal laws. So we need to pay attention to this one in the near future, especially with states like Oregon and their people legalizing some very illegal drugs in the past year. So pay attention to that one. And that takes us to the end of this section, um, and we'll finish this tomorrow.